Yashamati Nandana Prajavalada Gokulanjana Kana Yashamati Nandana Prajavalada Gokulanjana Yashamati Nandana Prajavalada His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Sikaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Shri Mayapur Dham ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai. Jamuna Mai ki jai. Bhakti Devi ki jai. Tulasi Devi ki jai. Samaveta Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanandi. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. Jai Shri Guru Varanga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Krishna Krishna. Hare Hare. Hare Rama. Hare Rama. Rama Rama. Hare Hare. Can we all sit down and socialize later? Can you all please come forward and sit down? If we don't have enough chairs, we can put another row of chairs over there. If you can please sit down, that would be great. Children, you can all sit in the front if you can keep quiet. If not, you can play outside. Okay? Thank you so much. Let's give a warm welcome to His Grace, Raja Bihari Prabhu with a Hari Bol. Hari Bol! Hari Bol! Raja Bihari Prabhu has been here in the past and is quite familiar with our community, small growing community. For those of you who do not know, His Grace Brother Bihari Prabhu joined ISKCON in 1977, and he was part of the strategic planning team from its inception in 2006. From 1978 to 88, he was part of ISKCON Detroit's Sankirtana team. He then moved to Vrindavan and served at Vrindavan Institute of Higher Education from 1989 to 2010. In 2002, he formed ISKCON Resolve. It is the conflict resolution initiative of ISKCON, where he still serves as a co-director. He has a master's degree in conflict resolution and has published many papers in this subject. He has been a consultant in Indian Supreme Court during his stay in India, and he is also now, in addition to all the service he does for ISKCON, he is also now working for the US government. And we are very, very grateful that Prabhu somehow found the time to accept our invitation and come here. We didn't call the seminar as conflict resolution, as you would have noticed. It's like how we can work together as a community in service to Srila Prabhupada and Krishna. So it's a very positive message. And I'm sure everybody will be greatly benefited by Prabhu's presence and make the best use of the seminars. So today, the time is between 7 to 9. That's what I understood. And tomorrow it is from morning, there is a Bhagavatam class at 7 o'clock. And then the first session is between 11 to 1. And again, the second session is supposed to be 2, right? 2 to 5. And Sunday again, morning Bhagavatam class at 7. And only one session in the morning, which is 10 to 12. Again, we have Sunday feast class in the evening. So please come and make the best use of Prabhu's association. Thank you again.
Does this look okay? I don't think we need that. Can you hear me? Yes.
This will interfere with that. Should I turn this off?
Yeah, I think so. Where did you get that information about me?
She gave.
Oh. I gave to you? No.
She just discovered, I think.
Yeah, TVC does. Om Jnanatilakandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurodilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadayam Dadati Svatam Mancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Vikasam Duvecha Patikanam Bhavanyo Vishnadeyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Prabhu, you did a very nice arti. First class arti. We don't always recognize the guitar, but they're doing something. So I'm very happy to be back in Naperville. And I heard that this may be a bit more of more people tonight than there was. So I thought, what should I talk about? And I decided that we should talk about assumptions, as you can see here, because they're probably the number one cause of conflict in the world. Number one. Okay. So, I thought we'd talk about that. And what I'd like to do is, well, let's see. Normally, because there's so many devotees, I guess we won't do introductions. But, well, and there's a marker for the flip chart? Oh, wow. That's so together. So when I say the word conflict. What word comes to your mind immediately? Just call it out. Violence. Wow. I better be careful on here. And someone else have difference of opinion? Yeah. What else? Passion. Tension. Disagreement. How about some of the ladies? Misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Forget my scribble. Anger? Ooh. Okay. What was that? Expectations. Especially unclear ones, right?
False ego.
False ego. We got a scholar here.
Too much experience to come.
What else?
Non-cooperation.
Non-cooperation. I'll just put Gandhi. I just said non-cooperation.
No trust, mistrust.
Mistrust. Mistrust, which leads to fight. And one or two more?
No.
Doubt. Yeah. One more. Power and difference. You have difference? Someone of the ladies said. Power. Power struggle. Struggle. Did you get the flip charts out of the? It has a sticky, but does it have the autocorrect? Spell check? Does that spell check? No. Okay. So let's look at if you can read my scribble, my handwriting. Difference of opinion, right? And none of these happen in Naperville, right? Only the Temple in Chicago. Difference of opinion, tension, disagreement, which is similar to this, misunderstanding, anger. Interestingly, expectations is a big cause of conflict. One of the most important things in any relationship, practically speaking, or giving someone a service in a temple, is to make sure the expectations are really clear. Otherwise, it's amazing how much conflict, power struggle, doubt, fight, mistrust, and this often is one of the things, lack of trust, that fuels these other things. Right? If you really trust someone, and even if they say something that seems weird or something, you kind of like just goes in one ear, not the other. And if you really distrust someone, even if they say something nice, you're right. Non-cooperation, false ego, which is, we could say it's the root cause of all the problems, right? And violence. If you look at all those words, what do you see a pattern? Or does anything come to mind when you look at all of them? Yeah, they're almost all negative, isn't it? Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's no one put down like wonderful, right? Or fantastic, right? But what we hope by the end of Sunday is that we can look at conflict through a different lens, and also see it as an opportunity, as something that if you have a conflict with someone, and if you work it out nicely, then was that me? And then at the far end of the conflict, it can actually be better relationships, right? I mean, even if you think of Chitraketu Maharaj, right? And he, well, whether it was an offense or not an offense, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But he becomes Vitrasura, becomes even this greater devotee, right, in his next life, right, after his little incident with Mother Parvati. Right? Um, good. So so we'll see if we have a different outlook by the end of Sunday. So I chose assumptions because, like I said before, that does this go up at all? Oh, great. That way I can see gentleman over there. Because it's such a root cause of so much conflict. So what I'd like you to do is just in groups of like 3 or 4 or at the most 5, think of assumptions that you remember from the Shastra. So we understand what assumptions mean, right? When like if I would have, instead of being picked up at the airport, if I would have rented a car and it was a Lamborghini or a Maserati or something, and I drove it here, right, and I had my sunglasses, I came out wearing all this fancy silk clothes, what assumption might you made about me? Right? Right? So we make assumptions about people all the time, right? We judge a book by its cover, so to speak. So what assumptions, we don't have to do it in groups right now. We could just do it. What assumptions do you remember from the scriptures? Yes? Oh, King Rahugana. Yes, right, yes. King Rahugana assumed that Jada Bharat was just this dumb person who's actually this greatly self-realized person. Very good. Yes? Yes, he said, yeah, okay, I can give you 3 steps of land, no problem. Right. King Dasarath, what was his assumption? He trusted Kaikeyi? Okay, yeah, I don't know if that was assumption, but he should have, yeah, right, okay. Yes, I see your point. Yeah, no, I see your point. You thought that she was going to ask, he assumed that she would ask for something really nice, right? And instead, vanquish Ram. Yeah, good. That's right, yes. Any of the gentlemen? Only ladies know Shastra in this place? Yes, Prabhu, you had your hand up? Yeah, what about that? Ah, right, that's right, they made an assumption just based on their, like, who are these, little kids, jello. Ah, right, very good, yeah, that's a very good one. You heard that? You could hear that? Yes, Prabhu. Okay. I assume that your daughter is really bored, but actually she's really interested in this. Right. So there's a lot of them. There's a lot of assumptions that are made, and some of them are really catastrophic. Like, well, how about this one? What did the followers of Lord Ram assume about Vibhishan? Right? They were all like, "This is a trick. He's, he's he's a spy. This and that." But Lord Ram understood his heart, right? And so he made assumption based on his birth, right? He was born as a demon, like Vritrasura was, right? And so sometimes we do that. We make assumptions about people based on their, where they're from. Like, let's say I spent, I think Mataji mentioned in her introduction, I spent 21 years in India. I lived in Vrindavan, but I worked in Delhi. So I think the most jokes people make are about Punjabis. Any Punjabis? Like, right, but isn't it true? People sometimes make jokes about Punjabis, right? Yes, we have this one very nice congregation member in our temple in Washington, D.C. Chaman Puri is his name, and he's been Pakka Punjabi, and he's always making jokes about Punjabi. I think you're allowed to. Is this something wrong with this? Well, in the meantime, you can give me I can hold the mic. TK, now it works? All right. If we hear any more, then we'll switch to the mic, the other mic. What were we talking about? Oh, Punjabis. What else do people make? Who else? They make jokes about blondes? Yes. Not in India so much because there are very few, right? But no, sometimes they make jokes about people from Bihar, right? So when I meet someone, they say, "Oh, so you're from Bihar? You're Bihar? I'm also Bihari, from Raja Bihari." Right. But people make fun of, right? That the Americans make jokes about people from Poland. People from Poland make jokes about people from Ireland. It's right. So we make assumptions about people based on their birth, right? Oh, you're from South India? You must be an IT professional. That usually is a correct assumption. but right. Also based on who people associate with, right? Who people associate with, the kind of the dress that we like that people wear, right? And sometimes even the accents that people have, right? I work a lot with Native Americans, with American Indians, not our Indians, but and lots of times when people assume that they're Hispanic, and lots of times people go up to them and start speaking to them in Spanish, and they don't understand a word, but again, by people's looks, right? Like it's easy to tell. For me, the easiest thing to tell is if somebody's from Bengal in India, right? Because that Bengali accent is so, it's quite different, right? Yeah. So we make assumptions a lot about people based on these kind of things, right? Well, you're from Gujarat, you must be rich, right? And probably have diabetes, right? All the sugar in everything, Shrikant, sugar in the sabji, sugar in the dal. Right. Anyone here from Gujarat? Very good. But he's both so skinny. Very good. Very good. Yeah. I'm coming to your house for dal dokali. My favorite prep in the whole world is dal dokali. Yeah. So anyway, we make assumptions about people based on a lot of these external things, right? And in the scriptures, there's a lot of examples of people assuming someone is supreme, right? So if you remember this pastime with the Yamadutas were really surprised. They've never been thwarted. They've never been stopped in their entire, career, right? And then the Vishnudutas come along and they think Yamaraj is the supreme, right? Because they just assumed that he was the supreme, and they were in for a big surprise, right? I remember one time I was at a health retreat in South India run by the Jindal Corporation, and my wife and I were there for a week, and we met this one person, Indian gentleman from Kentucky, in America, he's a professor, and we noticed he had a picture in his room of what's his name? Sai Baba? Yeah, Sai Baba. And anyway, so my wife said, "Oh, this picture of Sai Baba. What do you think of him?" And he said, "Oh, he's God." And my wife, who's so trained by Srila Prabhupada, she was drinking some water, right? And he said she's God, and my wife, in other words, he may be a saintly person, but assuming that he was God is problematic, So my wife just couldn't believe it. Again for us, because we were so trained in the Bhagavad Gita and things, it was really hard. And then what to speak of Narada Muni, right? When he saw Lord Brahma was in meditation, right? Then he realized he kind of had assumed that Brahma was the creator of everything, that he was the supreme, but he was in for a surprise, right? Oh, thank you. That's great. I will. That way, I won't sue ISKCON of Naperville when I fall. Yeah. Very good. And false assumptions about ourselves, because when Hiranyakashipu did all those austerities, can you see? When Hiranyakashipu did all those austerities, and he got those benedictions from Lord Brahma, who's on the swan, right? What were some of the benedictions? Couldn't be killed by any weapon. Not in the day, not in the night. Not inside or outside. What's that? Not by animal, not by human. So, wouldn't be, you pretty much think, hey, I can use that mic, not a problem. Yeah, no problem. But so he assumed he was immortal, right? He even says, "Oh, I'm immortal," right? So that was a wrong assumption. I can just walk around to that. This one off. Is that better? Hare Krishna? Okay. So yes, false assumptions. And then do 99.9% of the world have the false assumption about who we are? Right? We think that we're this body. Right? But Krishna says, Dehina shminyata dehe komaram yovanam jaratata dehantara pratir dhiras tatra namuyate. Right? That we're actually the soul inside the body. And it's all based on, what did somebody put? What's false ego, someone said? What's the Sanskrit for that? Ahankar, right. So ahamkar, I am this car. Right, yeah, that's kind of what we think, right? Yes. Okay, and when you think about it, so this is Chitraketu Maharaj, right? And of course it's a pastime, but, because for those of you who may not know the story, so he's in his airplane, and he comes upon Lord Shiva with Parvati sitting on his lap, and he's preaching to a whole bunch of sannyasis. So Chitraketu was actually being respectful, but he was just amazed, so he kind of laughed, like, wow, And Parvati assumed that he was making fun of Lord Shiva. So she cursed him. And then he became Vritrasura in his next life. And of course, it was a wonderful pastime, but, assumptions that can offend. And that's one reason we're bringing this up here, because we're in the Sangha of Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis. And practically the worst thing that you can do in this world is to offend a Vaishnava, a Vaishnavi, because they are dear to Krishna. Right? And so assumptions can offend. And this one, look at this offense, this assumption, when Parikshit Maharaj was traveling and he came to Samak Rishi's hermitage, and Samak Rishi was in deep meditation, didn't know he was there, but Parikshit Maharaj, what did he assume? That he was faking it, right? Yeah. And so in one sense, because of this assumption, Kali Yuga began, right? Because then Samak Rishi's son curses Maharaj Parikshit, and Prabhupada writes that a Brahmin, not acting like a Brahmin was the beginning of Kali Yuga. Of course, it's also because of this the Bhagavatam was spoken in between Parikshit. So a lot can happen when we make assumptions. You can start another yuga, right? So it's actually a really serious thing, and something not to because we do it all the time. You have to make assumptions. It's part of life. It's part of we do it all the time. When you're driving here, you assume that car is not going to run through a red light, right? Or we make so many assumptions, constantly. But ones that have to deal with family relations, with work relations, with any relationship that you have on an ongoing basis, it's really good to make sure that we got the assumption accurately. That's so easy. We just gave so many examples, and we could have, you also gave a number of really nice ones that weren't, here, and if we sat here long enough and thought about it more, we could probably think of a lot more, right? It's so amazing that they're all over the scriptures, all over the Shastra. Right? Even in one sense, Arjuna was thinking in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, right, that he was assuming that the most important thing is the family tradition and avoiding sin, all those arguments that he gave. And Krishna said, no, asocha nam asochaston. Okay, so any thoughts so far on assumptions? Should I assume that we should move on? Okay. Here's another assumption. When Vishwarup took sannyas, Sachimata thought that Advaita Charya had persuaded him to do so. Therefore, she accused Advaita Charya of this, which was an offense at his lotus feet. Later, Lord Chaitanya induced his mother to take the dust of Advaita Charya's lotus feet, and thus her Vaishnav aparad was nullified. Bless you. So there you go. There was another. Actually, I wonder if I had. What's that? Forget it. All right. I'll perform the austerity. Here's another one. In the city where Satyajit's younger brother Prasena did not return from the forest with the jewel, Satyajit became very upset. He did not know that his brother had been killed by a lion and that the lion had been killed by Jambavan. He thought instead that because Krishna wanted that jewel, which had not been delivered to him, Krishna might have therefore taken the jewel from Prasena by force and killed him. This idea grew into a rumor which Satyajit spread in every corner, in every part of Dwarka. Right? So there was gossip even in Dwarka. Is there any gossip in ISKCON of Naperville? Yes, really? Is it juicy? Is it good gossip at least? Yeah, so, it's really, gossip is very dangerous. Hold on. Oh, is this reach? So often what happens is that in a temple situation or something like that, two devotees don't get along with each other, right? Or, something happened, somebody said something about their kids, or they didn't, they cut in line during prasadam on Sunday, it can, right? It can be pretty much anything, right? It can be pretty much anything. And what often happens is if A feels offended by B, A doesn't go talk to B. Instead, A talks to someone else, right? Says, can you believe he's unbelievable. Isn't he a terrible person, right? And usually what will happen is they'll say, you promise you won't say anything to anybody, right? He says, promise, right? And then he turns to his husband and he says, did you promise you won't? And it goes like that. And so what C does, if C isn't well trained, C will tell D, D will tell E, and eventually B hears about this, right? So then B tells their friends, right? And you have Pakistan and India going on after a while. Acha. Hare Krishna. Let's see if you have to turn it on, right? Is it on? Is that okay? All right. So this is an evolution of microphones. Who said we don't believe in evolution? Hare Krishna. You okay? So the real secret, by the way, and we'll talk about this more in the next 2 days, is what should C do? Right? Yeah, C should what? Ask A and to B to talk to each other? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, right. And should not continue the gossip. Right? And or at least say, so A, what are you going to do about this problem that you have with B? Instead of doing this. Right? Yes, very good. Yeah. So it's something to keep in mind, because even in Dwarka, right? Even in Dwarka there was gossip. So what to speak of in do we have a name yet for Naperville? Is it New Mayapur or New Vrindavan or New? That's already taken. No new. Because Chicago's New Sevakun? Yeah? Yeah, and DC is New Hastinapur, obviously, because the capital. Yes, yeah. Yes. So we could call this New Rumorville. Okay. But anyway, you can see that even Krishna wasn't exempt from having gossip about him. Wrong assumptions made, even about the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Right. So what to speak of us? Right. Okay. So assumptions a little closer to home. So this time I do want you to go into groups of 3 or 4, just whatever you want to do, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and answer this question. Either this, what assumptions have you made that were incorrect, or what assumptions have people made about you at some point were incorrect. Okay, so just somehow break up into groups 2, 3, 4, and discuss. So you understand it's 2 parts. It's either assumptions you've made that were wrong or assumptions people made about you. Yeah, 5 is okay. Okay, so let's pass the microphone around and hear some of the ones that you came up with. Who wants to go first? Okay.
One of the assumptions we made is life will be happy by getting something like I get married, I'll be happy. I get I I'll get kids, I'll be happy. I'll get kids, I'll be happy. I'll get something, I'll get something, I'll be happy. Big assumption. Life is by assumption. That's what.
So most of the time, my assumptions are with kids, and whenever I say something, some task to do chore, so they don't do it. I assume they are lazy, they don't want to do, they are not responsible, and I start shouting at them with those assumptions. So instead of, but sometimes they express, I don't know how to do this. So as like,
I remember when my so my wife is the president of the temple in Washington D.C. So I'm like, what do they say? Like the first husband or something like that. And before she was a school principal in Vrindavan, so she's kind of a tough person. Her father was a general in the army. Yeah. The posts that hold up the lamps, they were made out of missiles in their house. Yeah. So anyway, so my son was born and raised in Vrindavan. He was born in Vrindavan and raised there his whole life. But he wanted to go to college in America, so he was studying for the SATs and took them in Delhi. And so he was a typical teenager. His room was a mess, right? But oh no, well I won't tell that story. I'll tell that later. But I remember one time. So he didn't like to study very much. Maybe because his mother was the principal of the school, he didn't think he had to. Although she never played favorites. So he didn't study, didn't do his homework. So one time I was determined that I'm gonna, give him this lecture on how important homework is. So one time he said, "Okay, Pitta," he calls Pitta, I'm going out to spend some time with my friends. I'll see you later. And so I not grabbed him, but I said, sit down. And I gave him this 10-minute lecture on, how important homework is and doing your duty and all that, karma, everybody, karate, the whole thing. Right? And he kept on trying to interrupt me, right? And I didn't let him interrupt me. And after 10 minutes, he said, "Pitta, I finished my homework." So that was an assumption. Yeah. Your group have a assumption?
So Prabhu was sharing that when he saw the devotees for the first time, he assumed that they are expecting something from me, like they want something from me. So yet to find out.
They wanted his soul.
So one was similar to that my kids, I assume, will listen to me. They don't. My kids would listen to me, but they don't. So it's similar. Another, well, no, this came from Mataji. Another assumption in the group was about appearance. So Prabhu says sometime you see a devotee chanting beads and you assume this devotee, would be a nice person, but may not be the case. And similarly, if you go to a social gathering and you see someone drinking alcohol, so you assume he or she is not a good person, but that didn't turn out to be the case. So appearance, right? And then another assumption was about, assumption about relatives, about us.
can just think of right now is that my parents were just like workaholics. They were always they just didn't really care, but in fact they cared a lot. That's why they were working so hard, because doing their best to provide.
I was thinking, you know what, especially I remember in the 70s, this happened a lot, that when, you know, somebody would become a devote, like this happened to me, and many devotees that I spoke to, that they had a group of friends. And in the 70s, we tended to be quite philosophical and talk about things. So many times we would go to our circle of friends after we learned about Krishna, and we say, this is amazing. We finally found the absolute truth. This is fantastic. And we assumed that they'd all want to be devotees. And they'd look at it like, you know, right? The assumption was wrong, yes. Now, what you brought up, Prabhu, is a interesting philosophical point, right? About you can meet a devotee and think that they weren't so nice, and meet someone who doesn't practice devotional or service or God consciousness, and they seem nice. Because that also would bring into the question, you know that verse, Yasyasti Bhaktir Bhagavati Akinchana, Sarvar Gunas Tatra Samasate Sura, Harera Bhaktasya Kuto Mahaguna Manoratena Sato Davato Bahi. That, because sometimes a devotee may not be so nice or appear to not be so nice, but it's kind of like saying to somebody when they're in the shower, you know, and you say, you're so dirty, right? But I'm in the shower, I'm taking the process to get clean, right? So at least the devotee is sometimes also compared to like you ever had a really hard green mango, right? You know, but you do know if you leave it in the sun, if you leave it, you know, in the proper place and let it'll eventually become ripe. So sometimes we are a little like green mangoes. But the good fortune, even about the devotee that we think is really rude and stuff, is that they're in the shower. And so if they are chanting, eventually, dire dire, they'll become clean. Whereas a person who's not a devotee, and I'm not saying, you know, ISKCON, Hare Krishna, just any God, you know, more general believer and follower of God, if they may be very, very nice, but if they don't have any connection, I was once listening to a lecture by Srila Prabhupada, and he was talking about this verse. By the way, the verse that I quoted, if you don't know it, it says that one who's a devotee have all the good qualities of the demigods, and one who's not a devotee doesn't have such great qualities because manoratena asato davato bahi, they're controlled by their mind. Right? So one time I heard Prabhupada say this, and it really helped me because I had this experience. You know, I go sometimes and you meet people who are non-devotees and they seem super nice. Right? I was just, yesterday I was in Salt Lake City. And so the day before yesterday I went to the Mormon church there. And they have these young ladies there dressed very conservative, and they all have name tags with their name and the country that they're from and the languages that they speak, because it's a big tourist place, right? And they're so polite. They're so well trained. They all, you know, even people when they're off duty, they walk by and say, "Have a good afternoon, hello." You know, it's something out of like a movie or something. You know, and I was saying, God, if our devotees were like that when visitors came to our temples, we'd, you know, make thousands of devotees. And of course, they are God conscious. Whatever we may think about some of the philosophical points of Mormonism, that's another thing. But in this one lecture Srila Prabhupada gave, it really helped me. It really gave me a lot of faith, because I always wondered where that verse sometimes is translated as, they have no good qualities. But Prabhupada said, what is the use of their good qualities in this lecture? So he acknowledged that people have good qualities. But if you think about it, if you just have good qualities in this one life, but you're not God conscious, then your next life, you know, destination unknown, right? So it's interesting that you brought up like a deep philosophical point. Yeah. What about the ladies? Assumptions? Or any other men? Whatever. I don't know where the mic is now. Okay. She's like, I don't want to mic.
Krishna Prabhuji. So some of the points that were brought up in our group was Mataji felt that when she came from India to US, she felt that, you know, it would be a much better life, a more happier, you know, version. Like there were high expectations, but then realized it's not that. It's almost the same or worse. One Mataji felt that.
Is that microphone on? Maybe it is. Okay. So that's again actually a philosophical point that both people made, similar, right? That we often even expectations came up on the list, right, of causes of conflict, that we expect something to be what it's not, right? If I just get that new Lexus, because my neighbor got a Toyota Avalon, but if I get a Lexus, I outdo them, right? You know, it's like that one gentleman I told you about, Chaman Puri, the Punjabi gentleman in our congregation. He's a builder by profession, and quite the successful. In other words, he makes a lot of money. So he was building a subdivision, and it was very exclusive. So there's only 6 plots. So the first person who bought the plot was, and I hope you don't mind me making this joke, it's his joke, not mine. But we can all laugh at ourselves, right? And by the way, I'm practically Indian. I've lived 1/3 of my life in India, right? And my son lived 2/3 of his life. So anyway, so an Indian gentleman bought the first plot, and he built this, big place, right? There's a lot of money in Washington D.C. But as they were buying it, they went up to Chaman and they said, well, what happens if the other people build smaller houses? The property value of our house will go down. Chaman said, don't worry. They're all from India. They're all going to want to build a bigger house than yours. He could joke like that. Yeah. But again, that expectation, that if I can just be better than the Joneses or the Agarwals or the Patels or whatever, the Reddys, that whole thing about comparison. Yeah. Even I'm glad you said that, because even Srila Prabhupada, he was surprised because he assumed that everything in America would just be wealth and like this, and he was very surprised when he saw the homeless people. He assumed that when he talked about assumptions, he assumed that, and he was very surprised to see that. He talked about it a lot in his lectures. Yeah. I'm sorry, I cut you off. What was the other one?
No, that's okay. The other one was that we assumed when we were working full time, that people who are not working can practice Krishna consciousness better than us, and we always assumed that would be a better way to do it, but kind of realize that that's not true.
Right. There's haituki apratiyata. There's no material impediment. Yeah. Thank you.
And one more was one Mataji felt that whenever her husband is talking to her, she felt that he's always upset or angry with her, and she just assumed that, and actually that was not the case.
Is he here? No. Okay. We'll keep that confidential about who she's talking about. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. Some of the other ladies groups? They're passing the mic.
There is a difference in the speed of when teenage kids talk and parents talk. Parents are a little slower than teenage kids. They talk really fast. So when I'm thinking something else, my daughter will think I am thinking wrong about her. Like she gets upset. Is there something I did wrong? What is it? Tell me.
Right, and it's interesting because you're saying basically they make assumptions about your body language because you're not saying anything. You're just by your body language. There's a lot. Matter of fact, we're going to talk about this, but in terms of communicating emotions, only 7% is the words that we choose. 38% is the tone of voice, and 55% is the body language. So we communicate a lot, and so your daughter's picking up on your body language. Yeah. Yeah. There, you know, Lord Chaitanya did that once, I'm sure many times, but when he was with Sanatana Goswami, and Sanatana Goswami had been given that very nice chadar. And Lord Chaitanya didn't say anything, but he kept looking at the chadar. I don't know exactly how he's doing it, but you know, in a disapproving way. And just by that language, Sanatana Goswami figured out what he was doing. But in this case, your daughter is misreading your body language, right? Yes. Yes. And I see that a lot. You know, there's, I'd say one of the biggest challenges, and I've talked to my son a lot. Maybe some of you know my son Gopinath. Did any of your kids go to the TSI? Okay, so you know, my son helped organize that originally, at least, yeah. So it's definitely a challenge for those of us who grew up, born and raised in India, and then raised our children in America. So like, you know, first generation immigrants, as they're called, because it's a different culture, you know, and probably the way you were brought up is the way your parents were brought up, their parents were brought up, their parents were, and then all of a sudden, America, and a different way of communicating. You know, they talk faster, like you said, or you know, less of an accent than we have, right? Right. I mean, it's very interesting, right? If you see, like, especially a child that was born in Chicago, right? And they have like a total American accent, and their parents are still going, yes, yes. You know, right? Right. You know, it's interesting. Someone else? We have another one.
I assumed a lot of Matajis are not very educated, but some were coming from IIT. I was so surprised. That was my bad assumption.
You assumed that Matajis were not educated, but someone who went to IIT? Acha. Gold medalist. Wow. IIT is much harder to get into than Harvard or Yale or MIT or Princeton, right? Like, sometimes they accept like 600 out of 60,000 or something like that. I used to go speak a lot at IIT Kanpur because it's only an overnight train ride from Vrindavan. Acha, okay. Leela Purushottam Prabhu has a program there, one of Rome Padmaraj's disciples. Your group? Oh, that's your group. Any of the young ladies have any assumptions? No? You? Go ahead. Use the microphone like,
okay,
yeah, like karaoke.
A lot of times we assume about our friends, like we talk a lot, like, you know, to our friends. So if you're calling them and they're not taking the call, you assume, you know, that something's wrong. Like you think a lot of things, and the person might genuinely be busy, you know.
Right.
Kind of assume that they're probably not going to talk to you, or you know, something like that.
Yes, that happens a lot, right? Someone doesn't pick up the phone. I wonder why they're upset with me. I have this a lot. My day job is I work for the Department of the Interior, the federal government, and I'll have people come to me with something like, at the end of on a Friday evening, they'll say, you know, "Have a nice weekend" to their boss, and their boss won't say anything back to them, and the whole weekend they're in total anxiety. You know, I'm in trouble. My boss doesn't like me. And then, you know, they talk to I talked to their boss on Monday and said, no, I must have been daydreaming or something. I didn't even notice it, you know. But we can assume that. My mother was a real worrier. Of course, we didn't have cell phones when I grew up and all that, but if I was like half hour late, she'd have the police driving up and down, you know. And I was just hanging out with my friends, yeah. Okay, so what about this question? Oops, wait a second, I got it. What assumptions do people make about ISKCON? Right? Or that you're a devotee of Krishna? What assumptions do you think people make about us? Yes? That we what? Everyone wears tie-dye. I haven't worn tie-dye since 1976. Everyone's a renunciate, right? Sometimes they think like that, right? Really? What a generation are you guys going from? I haven't even heard that word in 20 years. Yes. They're trying to proselyte. They're going to sell me a book in the airport. We haven't done that in about 25 years either. Right? What else? Only drug addicts join. Something wrong. Is something wrong? Yeah. Right.
How can you prove that Krishna is the Supreme Lord versus Vishnu is this? So they made assumptions through either hearing through the ears or reading books or other things, and questioned that assumption a lot. Even till today, even we've been in ISKCON 8-9 years, people still, ask us that question.
Yeah, I usually say Vishnu Sabti.
Yes.
I don't usually get into it. Yeah. Right. Unless I get into the whole thing. Well, Ram is much more Pakka than Krishna because Eka Patni Brata and all that stuff.
Each his own faith, I think, is very
Yes. So these are good ones. These two young ladies came up with the best ones. So. Yes. Hippies. Yeah. Yes, sir. If all my problems will be solved if I join ISKCON, right? Or they sometimes assume we're very rich, right? They've been to Juhu or something like that. Yeah. And if we were rich, we'd already have a temple over there, right? Right, yeah. Yeah, so people make that assumption, yes. Tomorrow. And it will be. That's a whole interesting thing. Yeah, anyway, we'll talk about that later. Okay. Talk about worrying, right? Oh, by the way, let's have a little fun. Let's look at a video, if we can. Okay. I don't know, but the sound isn't so important on this video. Let's see if it'll play, because I have it. I'm going through my. Oh, but you don't see it there. Huh. I think. Okay, give me a second here. We interrupt this program for tech. We have like 8,000 IT wallas in this room. Yeah. Assumptions can be correct, Okay, hold on. I'm just going to. What happened? Okay. I think it's the display is. That's the thing. Let's see if I can do this. No, that's not working. Yes, anyone good at apples? Mirror displays, that's important. There we go, okay. So now we'll go to this YouTube video. Okay. Yes? Can you see? Oh. Hey, this is. Okay. You got to be careful with assumptions that you make. Whoops. There we go. Stop. All right, back to the PowerPoint. It always takes a second, right, to, oops, okay. So we did those, yes. So Mark Twain always had some good quotes. So anyone here a worrier? Has anyone ever, oops, how did that happen? How do I get rid of that? Yeah, okay. I've had a lot of worries in my life, most of which never happened, right? Have you ever worried about something and that was going to happen in the future and it just didn't happen? Because we sometimes, the brain, especially when it's affected by tamaguna, often worries a lot about the, and well, rajaguna also, because you see, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, na soshati, na kankshati, right? He says, don't lament, don't hanker. Hankering about the future is passion. Lamenting about the past is more mode of ignorance, right? So assumptions, it makes an ass out of you and me. And or about this one, which one of those two has been in prison and is a felon, right? The assumption sometimes is the male black, but it's actually Martha Stewart, not Snoop Dogg, who have been in prison before. Or you ever, what about this one? You don't ever go up to a heavy-set woman and say, when are you due to have a baby? Because what if you're wrong? Right? It can really be insulting and embarrassing. Right? So that's another assumption that we don't want to. And sometimes, like in the example of Parikshit Maharaj and Samik Rishi, right? That a false assumption and then taking an action based on that false assumption can really sometimes get us in a lot of trouble, right? So here, this is what actually happens. I'll tell you a story. A true story. I was going to, for work, I was flying to, I'm sure, and no one here has ever been to Anadarko, Oklahoma, right? Anyone? No. It's a poor area. It's a Native American reservation. So I flew into Oklahoma City and late at night, and I rented a car, which I normally do, and the Enterprise car rental only had one car left, and it was a red Mustang convertible. So the rule is, so as government employees, we're only allowed to rent economy cars. We get these terrible cars like, well, I won't say because maybe one of you own one of those cars. But, you know, these small cars. But anyway, they had to give me the Mustang convertible because it's the only car they had left. So they gave it to me at the regular economy rate, right? So the next day I drove to Anadarko, and I think I must have had the top down. It was a really nice day, and you know, probably blasting Gauravani Kirtan or something like that, right? Or Niranjan Maharaj, I really like his kirtans. So I go to the office where I'm going to meet, and it's in this this mall, this strip mall, with all the stores boarded up, except for this one office in the corner. So there's a huge parking lot with, you know, weeds coming out of the asphalt, but you could see the Mustang from a mile away because there was no other cars, right? So I get out of the car, I have my computer, and I'm going to set up for training, and no one comes to the training. No one comes to the training. And so I go to the supervisor, I say, well, I'm ready, and he said, well, we canceled the training. I was like, you know, because I flew from Washington, D.C. to Dallas switched planes to Oklahoma City, stayed overnight. And I said, why? And he said, well, we are so sick of hotshots from D.C. like you. You know, we hate dealing with jerks like you. You know, we have to follow all the rules. We're in this very poor area, and you guys think you could just go rent expensive cars and break all the federal rules, right? So they made an assumption about me based on what? The car, right, yeah. So this is kind of how assumptions work. This is kind of how assumptions work. First, we just observe the world like a video camera would, right? Oh, thank you. Should I use this? Should I use this? How about this? Okay. And then, usually we tend to select some data, right? Like, if, like this young lady, where did she go? Oh, there she is. If I was wearing a tie-dye shirt and I had dreadlocks down to here, you'd probably focus on the dreadlocks and the tie-dye shirt, right? Okay. So we focus on something. In that case, they focused on the car. And they gave some meaning to that car because it wasn't like a Ford Fiesta, right, which is usually the kind of economy cars we get. A Ford Mustang has a different meaning, right, even though they both have 4 wheels and a chassis, you know. And then they made an assumption that I spent more money on the fancier car. They drew a conclusion that I was a hotshot from D.C. and a jerk. And I don't know about a belief, but they took an action by staying in their cubicles and not coming to the training. Eventually, you know, I explained to him what happened. We had a good laugh, and the training went on. But how long does it take to make an assumption about people? In a second, right? In a second, yes. Right, yeah. And if our assumptions, you know, we have to be careful about them because they're not always accurate, right? Like I used to, you know, it's very easy living in Vrindavan, especially when I was there, to make assumptions about Russian devotees, right? Because they tend to be, this is not an assumption if you say it properly, but they tend to be kind of eclectic, you know, they want to go to Radhakund, see what the Babajis have to do, and do this and do that, you know. So it would be easy to just generalize about them sometimes, right? You know, but we have to be careful if we're dealing with devotees, especially. So that's kind of how assumptions work, and it only takes a split second often to go up the ladder, right? So the point being that, well, we'll talk about them a little bit more, but that's how it works. And just like President Ronald Reagan used to have this famous saying, right? Trust but verify. Right? So sometimes it's good to check to see if our assumptions are correct. Right? When you said that to me, did you mean to, you know, criticize? Did you mean to belittle me? No, that wasn't what I meant. Well, actually, yeah, that's what I know. You know, right? Or one of my good friends in Krishna consciousness is Kadamba Kanana Maharaj, because he was the temple president for many years in Vrindavan. We still joke that we used to talk management after Tulsi Puja every day. Meet you. So even now, when we email each other, we say, "I'll meet you after Tulsi Puja." But he would say, "Love and trust." He said, "I love everybody. Trust?" Right. So the Gita says, right, that the mind is restless, turbulent, and very strong, O Krishna. And to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind. So you read that, and you might say, yeah, it's totally true. Krishna is going to probably say, yeah, it's okay, Arjuna, don't worry about it. But that's not what Krishna says, right? He says, yes, it's difficult, but it's possible by abhyas and vairagya, by practicing and by detachment, right? So really part of being careful about assumptions is really controlling our minds, right? And watching the mind as it just tends to, you know, the function of the mind is to accept and reject. right? Sankalpa, vikalpa. Right, that's what the mind does. People who are computer, it's really, right, isn't a computer just a zillion connections of 0 and 1s, right? Right, so the mind is very 0 and 1 oriented. And what is it oriented by? The mind's function is to protect the false ego. Whatever our conception is of who we think we are, the mind accepts and rejects according to what will give who we think we are, and therefore what we think will give us happiness. See, so in one sense, if we think the mind is a problem, the false ego is a big problem. Because based on our conception of who we think we are, the mind protects that identity. Yeah? Amazing, huh? So, but anyway, it's really important to try to control our minds and think, is there an alternative way of looking at the situation, right? And Prabhupada would say, this is one of his famous quotes, and I really like it, that a devotee is as thoughtful as a non-devotee is speculative. Right? So we're meant to be introspective and think about things, not just jump to conclusions. So, well, that we've already. So anyway, this is what we can do. We can question our assumptions and then seek some contrary data. Is there another way I can interpret this? Yeah, and I see you taking pictures. I can give everyone this PowerPoint. It's not a problem. But you can take pictures if you want. I'm just, yeah. Just like, so when are the drivers in Chicago really good? Better? Better than India. Yeah. Better than DC? Okay, yeah. So in DC, so when my wife and I are driving on the Beltway and we see someone weaving in and out of traffic, right, driving dangerously, instead of criticizing, we have this, we say, that must be a man driving his pregnant wife to the hospital. Right? Because why not make a positive assumption instead of a negative one, right? And this is really, I think especially in the association of devotees, for the most part, 90+% of the time, devotees do have good intentions. Sometimes they don't, sometimes their actions don't necessarily match their good intentions. But sometimes we often assume things about motive. Right? So at work the other day, this is a true story, you're going to laugh, but true story. A person came to me and said, the person in the next cubicle chews their cashews too loudly. Okay, that's fine. But then there's a motive. They said they do it on purpose to agitate me. Right? So we laugh at that, but don't we do that sometimes? We don't just question an action, but then we think about what their motive is. Right? Just like Parvati. It's one thing to say Chitraketu was laughing. Right? Another thing to say, and he was insulting Lord Shiva. And that's what we do sometimes, right? Like, let me see if I can do this really quickly here. Might cover this again tomorrow, but okay. Now, how are we? Oops, sorry. It's not coming? All right. So what do you see in this gentleman? What do you see? Muscles, okay. What? The beard? Victory, he won. Achievement? What? He's old. Joy? happiness. It's interesting, you see, we just heard two different categories. Some people literally said, what do you see? And they said muscles, a beard. Right? But some of you interpreted, right? Joy, that's nothing wrong with it, but joy, someone else said victory, right? So you see how the difference between an observation and an interpretation, right? You guys did really well. Lots of times people would just say happy, they just all talk about happiness, victory, this and that. No one will say muscles, even though I said, what do you see? So you guys are much more sharp than most people. But you see, but we are generally quick to not distinguish between just neutral observation and our interpretation, right? And for all we know, what if he actually just lost, right? Well, we don't know if he's celebrating. He might be going, darn, right? His eyes are closed. He could be going, darn, right? You don't know. Usually I pick another picture which is a little more even less clear, but you still get the idea, right? See, you already said he's celebrating. Probably, but he could be disappointed yet. Right? We need more data. Yeah. So when we do this, like for example, probably before you drove here tonight, the last thing on your mind was assumptions. Is that a good assumption? You were thinking, we're going to learn all about assumptions tonight, right? So, how do we get rid of that? How do we do it last time? Just go escape? No. What was it? There was this. Okay. So what happens is, in practically any learning, practically in any learning process, we go through this. Like, in one sense, we were unconscious that we didn't really know much about assumptions, right? We were just driving here tonight, and it wasn't really on our mind, right? Then we started, he's making a whole presentation about assumptions. We become conscious, and probably conscious that we don't think about them very much, right? So then the idea is to become a little practice at it, to actually catch ourselves. That's an assumption, right? And you become conscious that you're making assumptions, and you try to become good at saying, is this a good assumption or not, right? And eventually, like anything else, like learning to drive or riding a bicycle or something, it becomes second nature. You just don't even think about it anymore. You get used to it. Right? This is usually how the process of learning takes place in any situation. Right? Remember the first time you got behind a car, behind a steering wheel, right? Or I remember the first time I taught my son, and he's like, what do I do next, right? And now he just zip, doesn't even think about it, right? So we become good at that, right? So it's a nice process to keep in mind when we're learning anything. And in this case, learning to be more careful about the assumptions we make, and again, for really valid reasons, because they can hurt relationships, and they can also lead to, especially like we said earlier, Vaishnava aparad, which is practically, it should be the number one fear that we have in this world. Because that's the one thing that stunts our growth more than anything. Prabhupada tells that story, right? That when he was walking in Juhu Beach, kind of, for those who haven't been there, kind of a well-to-do part of Mumbai. And he saw a rich man with his son, and Prabhupada told his disciples, so how can you win the favor of that man? You can't buy him a fancy car or another bungalow or something. He already has as much, he can buy any car he wants. But he said, if you have a 1 rupee sweet and you give it to his son, and if his son is pleased, then the man will automatically be pleased with you, right? Even if it's only 1 rupee, right? So that's how we win the favor of Krishna, by pleasing Krishna's devotees. But the problem is the other side is also true. Could you imagine if you walk up to the rich kid and the rich man and the son, and you kick sand in this kid's face, you're you're not going to have very, he's probably going to hire a hitman or something, whatever. It's a great way to win that man's displeasure. So Prabhupada used that example with Krishna. So there's a real spiritual underpinning to this presentation tonight. And also, though, it's also a point about developing community. Right? That in a community of Vaishnava, because really, the temple is not, although of course it's built by donations and money, but really it's built by Krishna being pleased. That's actually what happens. And Krishna makes some arrangement. I mean, I can just tell you a story. So we're also building a temple in D.C. And it's Washington, so it's very expensive. So if anyone who's been to the temple in D.C., we're on this one street, which is, people drive a little fast. Anyway, there was a terrible car accident. And one of the younger, probably 19 or 20-year-old boy from India, born and raised in America, but his parents are Indian, died. So our head priest, Chaitanya Nitai Prabhu, Lakshman Mandari, he found out about this, and he went to the man's house and consoled him, and my wife went to see him and did some ceremonies and things like that. And the man donated $1 million to the temple, for the new temple. Just out of reciprocation. Where's that money going to come? So the point is that, really, if we develop a wonderful sangha of Vaishnavas, where we're on the negative side, we avoid offenses. On the positive side, we have loving exchanges, and we want to serve one another. And, that's the quickest way to build a temple, is by pleasing Krishna. Right? So that's kind of the underpinning of this. And assumptions are one of the practical things that if we make positive assumptions about it. The other thing is that as a parent and as a teacher, one of the best ways to usually deal with other people is to encourage them and have positive, instead of saying, "Oh, you'll never be able to do that," right? Saying you go to a devotee, say, "No, Prabhupada said impossible is a word in the Fool's Dictionary. You can do this. You can become a pure devotee. You can do well on that exam. You can whatever." Encouraging one another is also super important. That makes sense? Okay? Okay, so from now on, everyone loves each other? Bas. All right. So Prabhupada talks about that we have 4 defects, right? Right? That we make mistakes, we can be illusioned, we can sometimes have a little bit of a cheating propensity, and our senses are imperfect. So because of that, we should really be careful about our assumptions, right? Because we're not mind readers. We're not, we can't understand the intentions of another person, right? So just like if you look at, what do you see when you look at this? What do you see? Cow? Okay. What else? What? Tags. 2 faces. Yes. Did you see that at first? See? 2 faces. He saw it right away, the 2 faces. So we can all look at the same thing and see something different. What about this one? What do you see? Tree. 2 faces. Birds. Butterflies. So who's right? Yes, but you see, sometimes, a lot of times, both of us can be right about something. And not that I'm right and you are totally bogus. Right? But don't we do sometimes? I've actually done this with non-devotees, and sometimes I'll say, "No, there's 2 faces. No, there's just a tree. What are you talking about 2 faces? What are you, idiot? There's a tree and..." Right? But the reality is that they're both, right? Or what about this? We can both look at similar things, but from our different point of view, we see things differently. Right? Right? Yeah, so let's face it, we're going to have different perspectives in our community, right? Even we said there's people from Gujarat, people from Punjab, people from South India, right? So we sometimes learned different languages, right? We had different upbringings. We had parathas in Punjab and doshas in South India, and different food preferences sometimes, right? And things like that. Krishna created so much variety, even in one country, India, right? What to speak of the whole world, right? And we tend to look through our conditioning, right? We have our conditioning from our parents, from language, from our education, from our socioeconomic background, and what to speak of from our purva samskars, our impressions from previous lifetimes. It's amazing people get along at all, right? Because it's kind of like, if this was a movie screen and we were watching a movie, we all are living in a movie, and we all think we're the star of the movie. And if we're married, maybe we have a co-star. But pretty much like everyone else is like an extra. Right? But we're the star. But if you imagine if there's 40 of us in the room maybe, if we had 40 movies going on at once on the screen right now, right? It would be total chaos, right? Right? So what we're trying to do here is be less about our individual movies and more focused on Krishna's movie, and being focused on him and his pleasure, right? But don't be, it is Kali Yuga, right? Anyone question that? Right? It is Kali Yuga, so we should be surprised if there's going to be little things. But Prabhupada would often say, just like he said about husband and wife, he said they shouldn't take their arguments seriously. You're just like, okay, tell him. Right? And by the way, the worst thing, if like let's say a husband and wife are arguing and the husband goes to one of his friends and said, "Oh, my wife is like this." You should never say, "Yeah, I'm sure your wife is really like that," because what'll happen is he'll make up with his wife and then he'll be angry at you for criticizing his wife. Right? Yeah. So that's about being a Sikh, right? A good Sikh. You just see. I was thinking when I retire, I'm going to write a book called "Being a Good Sikh." Because that's really like one of the secrets in a good community is that when people are in the position of a Sikh, they don't perpetuate the conflict. Yeah. So matter of perspective is really. It's just good to just appreciate that if another person has a different opinion of you, you shouldn't be surprised. Right? They're an individual soul, and they have different experiences in life, right? Because we also, even our experiences in life are, make impressions in our mind. Any thoughts on perceptions? By the way, I'm very conscious we have 7 minutes left. I don't want to keep you too late on Friday night. I'm sure you all want to get up at 2 in the morning and chant all your rounds before Mangalarti. That's my assumption. No, my wife is like that. She doesn't go out late for preaching. She takes rest by 8 every night, gets up at 2, chants all her rounds, and then goes to Mangalarti. That's like clockwork every day. And she just figures that's part of her service. But I fly here and there. I sometimes take rest when she's waking up. We see each other for 2 minutes. Okay, so this is a similar point that if you think about it, in any communication with any human being, you only get 50% of the picture, right? When I speak to you, I know my intention, but I don't know the impact I have on you. And when you speak to me, I know your intent. I know the impact you have on me, but I'm not positive about your intention. So again, it's like a petri dish for conflict, right? Because it's so easy for intention to not match impact. Right? Actually, maybe we'll end. How many more slides do I have? Oh, this is good intentions, bad results. Right? So let's watch one last video and just debrief that, and then we'll call it a night. Awkward performance review. So see what assumptions and the intention and the impact, see how they are not in sync.
So that's like to get nothing special. What about you? See about the chip?
Oh, wait,
Monday.
it's too
Today
fast.
is a good day. It's my performance review. You were like,
Let's
special. What about you? You seem rather chip before Monday. Today is a good day. It's my performance review. Wait a minute. You're excited about the performance review.
My next meeting is a one-on-one. I have to deliver a performance review. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's with Matt. Oh, I can see why you're so depressed.
Man, I'm stoked about this one. Because last time Melanie gave me kind of a bad review.
Last time I gave him an extremely negative review.
What exactly did she say? You know, mump with jumbo manager speak.
I couldn't have been more clear.
Like needing a little touch up here and there.
His appearance was sloppy, he was passive and unmotivated,
Maybe he'd learn some more stuff.
and the quality of his work was completely substandard.
And we talked about my future.
I also said that I didn't see much of a future for him.
Dude, you have to read between the lines, but she was majorly hinting that I could go places.
I don't think he's going to make it to the end of the year anyway.
With a little spit and polish, no big deal. So that's what I did. Got myself some spit and polish. Buddy, you're looking at Mr. Improved.
If anything, he's gotten worse. I don't know which is more objectionable, his social deficiencies or his technical incompetencies.
I mean, I busted my hump this last year. I even took some night classes at the community college. I can see why you're so enthused about things. It's more than that. I think I'll finally get that promotion I deserve. And believe me, with a new baby on the way, I could use all the cash I could get.
I'm putting Matt on probation, and that means no yearly bonus, but fortunately I hear his wife has a good job.
Especially with my wife losing her job and all. Sorry to hear about that, mate. Tell you what, you give me a call after the review and we'll celebrate over lunch or something. Cheerio.
Well, call me for lunch later. I have a feeling you're going to need to take a break. Well, Matt, are you ready?
You bet. Now, I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, I know. And maybe it's just nerves because my wife lost her job and all. But you'll see I deserve that promotion.
Promotion?
Yes. And I have you to thank. You know that little pep talk last time? And with being a new daddy and all. Anyway, I'm just so excited to hear what you have to say.
So did you see any intention not matching the impact? Or any assumptions? Yes? What? Completely opposite. Yes, yes. So if she said she couldn't be more clear, and he said you had to read between the lines. She was majorly hinting I could go places. So we don't know what the mid-year performance review was like, but either she was really clear and he was really thick, or maybe she wasn't so clear, right? But you can see how communications just didn't match at all, right? Like that. So we want to not end up like that when we're dealing with one another. Okay? So thank you. So I hope that this will really help us be more conscious of the assumptions that we make in life, because we do them all the time. We probably make 20 or 50 assumptions every day, and that's just natural. You know, it's part of life. But we don't want to have good intentions and bad results. Even there's that saying in English that the road to hell is paved by good intentions. So having good intentions is important, but also being able to communicate them is important. Very, very important. Otherwise, the tendency of the mind in Kali Yuga is to make negative assumptions. That's the tendency of the mind. Udared atmanatmanam, natmanam avasadayat, atmaiva hi atmano bandur, atmaiva vipuratmanaha. That Krishna says in the 6th chapter of the Gita, that mind can be the vipur or the bandur, the friend or the enemy. And in Kali Yuga, it tends to be the enemy. So it's part of controlling the mind. Yes, Prabhu? Yes. Yes.
Especially at workplace, is, you know, things that are not in your control. It could be a difficult person, toxic boss, toxic culture. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's my profession. That's what I do for the federal government. But not everyone, I'm the ombudsman for the Department of the Interior, but not every organization has an ombudsman. But that's literally what happens. I get calls all day long from people who, you know, at least claim a toxic environment. But I think for us in this room, if we're not the CEO or the, you know, the project lead or the main supervisor, in other words, what you're saying is, if we're in a position where we don't have much influence, right, then the first thing sometimes to recognize is to be at peace with the fact that maybe we can't do much about it, right? Because sometimes just worrying about something that's beyond our control is kind of like the definition of insanity, right? And at the other time, in the other sense, we might have more influence than we think. At least we can be a good example at work, right? And if someone, and if anyone ever makes us a C, be a good C, right? Right, and not just perpetuate gossip and things like that. But I think I found many times that people come up to devotees in the workplace and say, "There's something different about you. What is it?" You know, because they see that devotees don't get so bent out of shape in the workplace and are more tolerant than the average person, and we can often sometimes keep in mind the big picture, right? I mean, if Lord Brahma can live for 311 trillion years, we could probably tolerate this new boss for the next 6 months. You know, you know what I mean? We can put it in perspective of eternity. You know, and also we can even be philosophical. Well, I guess Krishna has arranged this for some reason, and what is the lesson that I'm supposed to learn in this situation? But if the workplace does have an ombudsman or has a good HR department or like that, then sometimes we can get practical help from that. But yes, there are some. Have you ever had a toxic manager? Yeah, well, that's yeah. So when the going get tough, the tough get going. Yeah. You had the best boss. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, but it's what I find happens a lot is two people are peers. They get along well, and then one of them gets promoted to be the other person's supervisor, right? And then they think that they have to be like Stalin or something. Yeah, I find that happens a lot. But in Krishna conscious. Right now we have such a mellow, loving temple president here. That, no problem. Yes. Although her son, very bad person. That's a joke. He's a wonderful person. A good friend of my son's. Other thoughts? Okay. Yes, Prabhu. Was that a big mistake tonight?
No, one positive was okay for the question before I came here, but I'm going to make it as a positive assumption that you yourself being a grandpa, you have spouse, you have children. So my assumption was that you have yourself used these techniques or best practices or philosophy to solve these communication issues in your own life or your child, and they work.
Well, I wouldn't ever. One time, many years ago, in like 1991, when I was first getting interested in this, and my wife and I took one of those empathic listening courses, where you say, it sounds like you're really concerned. And I came home that evening, and I told my wife, it sounds like you're really concerned. And she said, don't try that listening stuff. Remember, she's a general's daughter, so. But it works. It works on unsuspecting people. Yeah, no, it does, and we've been trying to teach this all over the world of ISKCON. We've, as Mataji introduced me, we have this project called ISKCON Resolve, which is now pretty much all over. Well, it's in many countries where we train devotees to help in conflict resolution and learn some of these skills that we'll be covering in the next 2 days. Like that. So one bad thing about speakers is when they go overtime, and I've already gone 6 minutes overtime. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna, all glories to Srila Prabhupada.